I've been working on a boomer shooter for almost an entire month now. I was messing around a couple months ago with a Half-Life style NPC system for my portfolio, and it really got me wanting to make a boomer shooter. The game itself wasn't actually a boomer shooter like Quake, but the PS1 style graphics really just made me want to do it. A couple of years back, I actually worked on a similar project, but it really just did not go well. I was still pretty new to making 3D games, and it was just too big of a project for me to commit to at the time. By the end, my code was a complete mess, and it was a nightmare just to implement a new feature like an enemy or a weapon. Also, let's be real, I played ULTRAKILL and I thought it was cool. That game was literally just ULTRAKILL down to the levels and the enemies and the weapons. I've also been working on my game Nocturnal Throne, which also taught me a lot of new things, like making a settings system that doesn't suck, and how to generally just go about doing things. So anyways, like I said, that Half-Life 1 style project really stuck with me. So I've been prototyping some stuff for a month or so, and I think I've really gotten somewhere. The game initially started looking like this. You can float around and shoot enemies. The enemies are also just floating balls that I drew with MS Paint. I think at the time I was obsessed with a game called Fractal Block World, and I just really wanted to make a boomer shooter version of it. You had basic weapons like a pistol, railgun, and a rocket launcher, and levels essentially consisted of these arena fights. You get locked into a room and you must kill every enemy to progress. Well, I'll keep this part short since the game is dramatically different now, but I began to adopt the PS1 style into the game. I remodeled all the enemies to fit the style, and I textured all the levels. The game still had the Fractal Block World HUD, which honestly I really enjoyed, but as the game got more detailed, I realised I had to switch it out for something a bit better. I came across these pixel guns and I decided to use them in the HUD to display the weapons. And yeah, actually, weapons. No more invisible weapons. I added some simple weapons that just float in the air. I modeled the weapons and I textured them myself. But the game was coming along great. The only issue was that it just wasn't fun. Like, not even slightly. The movement was so boring. You float around the levels at the exact same speed, and you hold the left mouse button until the enemy you're looking at dies. Now, with hindsight, I could have gone a different route with movement and just made the game more like a dogfighting game where you have airplane controls, but I really just was not ready for that kind of scope creep. The levels would need to be significantly altered, and honestly, it just wasn't the game that I wanted to make. Level design also was impossible. Like, how do I make a level where the player can float to anywhere they can see? All the levels would need to be boxed in so that they couldn't fly away, and this meant every level had to take place indoors. And I could just see that getting boring extremely quick for the player, and for me who's actually making these levels. The game was just quickly falling apart, and I was starting to panic a bit. The simple project that was supposed to take a few months to make was suddenly starting to look like it was going to increase in scope significantly. I finally made the decision to scrap the floating mechanic and make the game a lot more similar to Quake. I quickly remade the movement, and using a similar technique from my Half-Life clone, I made a nice B-hop mechanic. I sort of hate the timing mechanic of most B-hops, so I made it so when you hold space, you automatically jump. This way you can just focus on the shooting and platforming rather than focusing on the actual timing. In a few days I'd ended up with this, and I am super happy with this movement. I also added a wall jump since they're one of my favourite platforming mechanics. I debated on a dash or a slide, but I just didn't want to fall back into my loop of remaking ULTRAKILL. And I also thought that the B-hop was a much more fun way to pick up some speed. Another problem was the enemies. They still float as if the player can float. And about that, I actually ended up not changing them. I found it still really fun to fight these floating enemies, and it's also just a simple way for me to make enemies. In my old boomer shooter that I tried to make, enemies were just the worst thing to add. You had to set up their models, then rig them, then animate them, then set up their AI, and then bug test their AI, and then you have to make sure they can actually move around the environment you put them in. It was just a nightmare. However, with the floating enemies, I model them, I texture them, and I slap them into the game. And then I can just add anything extra on top. Like this blue guy who dodges periodically and fires projectiles in different directions. He genuinely took me less than an hour to implement, whereas in the previous game, it could have been weeks per enemy. Oh, there's this big green guy as well who shoots explosive projectiles and protects himself with a shield. He only took a couple hours. So yeah, I think I'm going to stick with the floating enemies. I do like the idea of having marine enemies too, sort of like the marines from Half-Life. The lore. The lore is something that I'm not really too focused on at the moment. My idea for the story is some kind of plague happened on Earth and everybody got transformed into the Orbs. A select few remained afterwards due to a natural immunity to the virus, and were pretty much just left to fend for themselves. It spreads sort of like zombies, so you need to be bitten by an orb to transform. Later on, the main character will encounter the military, whose solution has essentially just become to kill everybody and let the orb starve to death. Like I said, I'll work on the lore more later. The gameplay is the more important thing at the moment. You can actually play the demo right now, which has early versions of all the levels. There are currently 4 of them, with the first one being a very short tutorial. Definitely share your times in the Discord. I'd love to see people speedrun this game. Anyways, these videos should get a bit longer once I'm further into the game, but I do post a lot of clips from this game on the channel, so just keep an eye out for them, and most importantly, have fun.